Hello, welcome to our virtual launch of Murray Hiebert's book Under Beijing's Shadow, Southeast Asia's China Challenge. My name is Dr. Huong Le Thu, and I'm Senior Analyst at Defense Strategy and National Security Program at ASPI, and I lead Southeast Asian Research Agenda. Just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land from which ASPI broadcasts this webinar. And a couple of housekeeping reminders for those who are new to the platform. We have a Q&A function where you can ask questions live, and I'll try to get to them at the second part of our discussion. And there's also an option of upvote questions that you see and you'd like to hear, particularly Murray's answers from. So those are the options for our audience who interact with our speakers today. I am particularly excited to talk about this book with the author, Murray Hiebert, whom I've been admiring and reading all the analysis for years long. So today we talk about his newly published book, a fruit of, I would say, a couple of decades of research analysis and a couple of years writing the book. And I'll ask in a minute for Murray to speak in 15 minutes of all the findings he found. But quickly, for those who don't recognize Murray, Murray spent years, decades in Southeast Asia and working on Southeast Asia. He's been recently with the CSIS Center in Washington. Before that, he was the director for Southeast Asia at the US Chamber of Commerce. And also he's got a long career in the journalism, writing for Wall Street Journal or Far Eastern Review, among others. I know that this topic has been Murray's very much interest for a long, long time. And there's a lot to cover. It is one of the most exhaustive and detailed books I've had the pleasure to read on the Chinese influence and Chinese rise and the impact of it to Southeast Asia, particularly on the geoeconomics, the Belt and Road Initiative, but also on the issues like military engagement, the soft power or Chinese strategy soft power, and as well as the issue of ethnic Chinese across Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a very important region, and it is recognized now as really at the fulcrum of the great power competition. But Murray, you've been looking at Southeast Asia for decades, right? And China is by no means a newcomer to the region. The great power competition is also not entirely new, as you have reminded us in the book of the incidents in the Cold War as well. So what prompted you to write the book now? What did you find that was surprising for you after years looking at the region? Why don't you start telling us how Southeast Asians are dealing with the current rise of China?
Thanks, Dr. Huong Le Thu, really, and you and ASPI for hosting me here today. Yes, like you said, China is not new in the region. It didn't just move there last week with aircraft carrier or something. It's been neighbors to these countries, to many of these countries for an awful long time. Many of the countries like Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam ultimately had lots of their population come from China. And China traded with Indonesia beginning centuries ago. Then China also occupied Vietnam for 1,000 years, ending about a millennia ago. And also thousands of Chinese have migrated to Southeast Asia, often to help the colonial powers like in the British in Malaysia with their tin mines and some of their palm oil plantations. But what's different this time is that China is, it's involved, China is much bigger, has much more clout, it's united. And so it can have much more impact on the much smaller neighbors. It's played a major role since the late 1970s, early 80s. Economically, it's the largest trading partner. It's getting increasingly important as an investor. It's a lender, it's a builder of infrastructure, as you alluded to. And since 2009 has been much more assertive in making its claims in the South China Sea and pressing countries to give up looking for some of its oil and gas resources, even in its own exclusive economic zone. And then now increasingly China, which is involved in a trade war with the United States, which makes countries in Southeast Asia that are heavily dependent on both the US and China quite anxious. How I got interested in this, so I was a NGO worker back in the day, and I happened to be in Vietnam right after, in 1979, right after China invaded northern Vietnam. And one night, I got a knock on the door, and my host asked me if in the middle of the night, and asked me if I wanted to go to Lan Son, which is a town on the China border. It had been destroyed destroyed, yes, as China withdrew its troops. So that made a great impression on me. And then I was in Thailand as a journalist in the 80s watching China arm the Thais to provide weapons to the Khmer Rouge and the non-communist resistance. And then in the early 90s, I was living in Hanoi when Vietnam and China normalized relations, and I saw how trade picked up very quickly. And I was also based in Malaysia and Singapore later in the 90s, and saw how China's economic role just growing increasingly. And then, as you mentioned, being involved in a think tank, I had an opportunity to watch a lot of what's happened in the last decade in the South China Sea, in places like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. And so eventually in 2017, I don't know, the light just went on one day. You should be writing a book about this. And I recognize now how popular the book is, how popular the topic is, because there are 3 other books coming out also just about at the same time. But the book is roughly an overview of how China's rise is affecting the countries of Southeast Asia. It's fair to say that countries feel both a great opportunity and an immense challenge. I describe the economic opportunities, the Belt and Road, which provides infrastructure, describe the challenges on the Mekong River, where China is building dams on the upper reaches, has 11 dams in China, and then it's building dams in Laos and Cambodia, which are blocking water, fish, silt, and having a lot of impact on the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia and the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. I also talk about the ethnic Chinese. There's an increasing influx of ethnic Chinese in places like northern Myanmar, northern Laos, Vientiane, the capital of Laos, Bangkok, Manila, and elsewhere. Like you said, I talk about military ties growing. There's a growing arms sales, but still much smaller than the United States, and more military exercises. China is increasingly active. It's got a very broad toolbox, and so it's introducing elements of soft power through scholarships for students, Confucian institutes that are teaching Mandarin in all these countries, and invitations to party officials, monks and imams, academics, journalists. And then in some countries, it's getting a little bit more active politically, but not nearly as active as it's been recently in the last 2 or 3 years in Australia or New Zealand. And then I ended the book. I had to submit it early in January. And so I did not get to cover the COVID and the impact that's going to have on China, Southeast Asia, nor the increase in Southeast Asia, the impact on Southeast Asia of the increasing US-China trade war, which Southeast Asia is very anxious that it's going to get squished between the two powers and be economically hurt, particularly economically. You asked, Huong, about some things that really surprised me. I guess one of the things that surprised me was how hard it is for China to get its Belt and Road initiatives off the ground. Even in little countries like Laos, it took China 5 years to negotiate the railroad. They negotiated over how much Laos would kick in, how much China would kick in. They negotiated over how much land China would get on each side of the railroad. They negotiated over the interest rates. It took a long time. And I guess, we've seen that the Thais, who, despite the military coup, which got them much criticized by the US and the EU, the Chinese thought they were going to be able to continue the railroad after Laos, and that's been proven very difficult. The Thais are not terribly interested. The Chinese, they don't think the Chinese interest rates. The Chinese came down to 2%, but Thais think they can get it cheaper on the free market. They don't necessarily want to depend on China technology, Chinese workers. So it's really tough. And then in the case of Malaysia, there was Prime Minister Najib Razak was basically ousted because he got involved in overpaying the Chinese and in a considerable corruption involved in the East Coast Rail Link and some oil and gas pipelines. I guess another thing that a little thing that maybe isn't as interesting as it is in Australia as it is to Americans, but after the war in World War II ends, the Thais were trying to decide if they should go for a couple of years. Were trying to decide if they should go with China or the United States. But the General Pibul Songkram was letting some of the foreign ministry officials make a lot of contact with the Chinese, meeting with Zhou Enlai and others. And then in 1957, Pibun was toppled by another field marshal, and then the Thais decided to tilt toward the United States and support the war effort. But what was really fascinating, and that I did not know before, is that in 1966, when Lyndon Johnson, the president, was facing a lot of trouble getting reelected, partially because of the Vietnam War, he reached out to the Thais that had been making the initial overtures to the Chinese, and he gave them a letter which they delivered to China, but the guy that delivered it arrived on the day that the Red Guard took over and the Cultural Revolution took over the foreign ministry, and he was kicked out of China with the Lyndon Johnson letter still in his pocket. And but the letter did say, according to this guy, his name's Sang, according to his daughter, who saw the letter, she revealed that it talked about looking for China's help in ending the war, and also looked for ways to start normalizing relations with China. So it happened considerably before Nixon and Kissinger finally went there in 1969 and 72. I don't know if let you ask some questions, or maybe
we can start. We can start with some diving into the very diverse region. Your book really gives justice to this very diverse region, and your book really does make an effort to focus on each of the 10 ASEAN countries. Even I was really so pleased and surprised to read such details on Laos, for example, or Brunei, the countries and cases that we don't often get as much discussion and exposure on. So hopefully during this webinar, we will have an opportunity to dive into some of the or even all of the Southeast Asian countries. But Murray, I think China also recognized that the region is very diverse, that each country has very different national interests, they have very different socio-economic context, but and China is tailoring its strategy towards them. But by and large, through the examples that you've mentioned, through the BRI project, infrastructure investments, natural resources explorations, as well as Mekong, I think by and large, we could summarize China's approach to Southeast Asia as being based on building interdependence, right? Through those connectivity, through the shared links, through shared corridors, a system of dams, where China has obviously upper hand in this system of interdependence, where China has leverage because of the projects and investment, and potentially exert control, isn't it? It was very interesting how you showed the obstacles to the grand plan of the Belt and Road Initiative. In my reading of those cases is that, yes, in short term, they do offer opportunities, especially for the elites, often in the Southeast Asian countries, not so much to the locals, because not much more new jobs are created. A lot of local people are relocated, isn't it? And then there's an influx of Chinese workers. But in the long term, those projects tend to risk a lot of long-term negative impacts, such as higher level of indebtedness. There's social friction, and through those infrastructure projects and beyond, but through them, China is not showing very much a good soft power image. There's a lot of tension and resentment in local communities. So do you think China recognizes that and will adjust the BRI, adjust their infrastructure strategy to Southeast Asia? Or do you think it is a very set strategy that they will continue to pursue?
Well, I mean, China sometimes shows quite a bit of sensitivity, and then other times not so much. But we saw with the 2019 Xi Jinping had a conference in Beijing about the Belt and Road, and invited a lot of the leaders from the region. And he talked a lot about needing to be more transparent. He talked a lot about needing to rein in corruption, which is pretty rampant. He didn't talk too much about, the people who are displaced, and he didn't talk. He took a nod at environmental concerns, but a lot of the projects have real damage environmentally. And in some of the Chinese projects, even in Laos, there is this special economic zone called King's Romans in the far northwest of Laos, and the Lao leadership let them take over a huge swath of land. A small part of it is the casino, and which got rated very poorly by the U.S. Treasury Department. They sanctioned 5 of the key leaders for trafficking and prostitution and trafficking animals, trafficking on people, etc. But the saddest part of that is I found some research done by a Thai scholar that talked about how the people they dislocated were ethnic minority Lao who were doing very well, were quite well off, lots of cows, big amount of land, nice houses. And they were forced off that land and tried to protest to the government. The government wouldn't listen to them. And now they're living along roads and have not very poor land far away from their houses. And this land still hasn't been developed after 7 or 8 years by the King's Romans outfit. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction over by people that are forced off their land. That's true in basically in Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, also. So I think they're like I said, they recognize that some of their behavior is, and then of course the debted issue. Laos has their debt is about 2/3 of their GDP, is equal to 2/3 of their GDP. Half of that is to Thailand, some of it's to Thailand, but most of it is to China. And they are, there is concern that Laos may be in the end, like the high-speed rail, it's just going from Kunming to the Mekong River across from Thailand. And what is it going to ship? That is not a highly populated route. Thailand says it's not going to complete the high-speed rail. They have other priorities right now. They don't want to do it for at least a decade. And so Laos is going to have real trouble making money off this thing to even repay its a small amount of new debt for the railroad and the costs of resettling people. So it's and like you said, there was a UN rapporteur who visited Laos about a little over a year ago, and he made a lot of comments on China building huge infrastructure like dams, like the railroad, like the casinos, that there's really very few jobs for Laos. And so it's going to create very few jobs. And so it's, you know, the dams that they have built, I understand, maybe produce about $20 million a year for revenue for the government, which is terribly small considering how much these dams cost, $2 billion or so each.
We get some questions coming in, but I'll stay a little bit with mainland Southeast Asia for a while, because in your categorization of the Southeast Asia, the mainland Southeast Asia is the first among three groups. So you divide all 10 ASEAN countries into three groups. The first one is so-called the near abroad, which is Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. The second is the big guys in mainland Southeast Asia, which is Vietnam and Thailand. And the third group, you call it the maritime periphery of China, which include Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. Let's stick with the mainland Southeast Asia for a little while, because we have such a rare opportunity to talk in depth about it. One thing I found particularly useful was not just talking about China and how China's grand rise and wealth attract the countries, but also actually the role of other Southeast Asians, the intra-Southeast Asian relations that may affect the strategic calculus of each of them. And I'm talking particularly how Laos and Cambodia look to China as a way to offset the imbalance with Vietnam and Thailand. So Vietnam and Thailand have played their role in the region, and Cambodia in particular was pivoting towards China as a way to offset that imbalance. And you said also Laos had more strategic and diplomatic space thanks to Vietnam, because it has an option of Vietnam as playing a really important investment role, and it actually has more strategic space than Cambodia. So that was very interesting to have those intra-regional relations. And I'd like to ask you a question about Laos in particular, because Laos is a very important country for China and for its BRI strategy for the US or even other countries in that are interested in the region, like Australia or Japan, maybe to lesser degree Japan. Laos is often seen as too small, too far away, and too poor. It's still, you know, the status of the least developed country that you hope to graduate from this year, right? But to China, Laos is critical for its BRI. US, the first US president to visit Laos only was Barack Obama 2016 for an ASEAN-US summit. It's not only for Laos itself, and it is a country where you know, it was bombed as much tonnage of bomb as you know, Europe and Asia during the World War II. So over 2 million tons of bombs. So on average, you know, there is nearly a ton per every person in Laos. So, but for China, it is a very critical one. And you said that despite the sheer imbalance and despite the attractiveness of Chinese project, Laos is still managing to negotiate and double think about this project. But at the same time, I also sense a sense of a little bit of despair in Laos, as one quote your book mentioned is they face a situation where there is a choice between vanishing traditional economy and a new model of rapid economic development designed by China. Now, neither of those options are particularly attractive, but because the Chinese offer is there, a lot of Lao would go for that Chinese design economic model. Is that what you wanted to convey?
Yeah, that's one of the themes. Yeah, so it seems the leadership in particular is enthralled by what the China can provide so much, so fast. I think the population is often a little bit more wary because they don't see themselves benefiting very much. But and you know, so much of, like I said, the infrastructure is so big, it looks totally out of place. You know, the new hotels China has built along the Mekong look like they belong in Beijing, not in a tiny little city like Vientiane. But Laos does, like you alluded to, have a little extra space politically, partially because of their long-standing ties with the Vietnamese Communist Party and leadership. And so when China puts you know, a lot of pressure on, they can also rely on at least a little bit of help in pushing back from the Vietnamese. The Cambodians, however, you know, because they don't want to have close relations with the Thais or the Vietnamese for a lot of historical reasons, are much more beholden. And so Cambodia in the ASEAN context often plays a role of blocking ASEAN consensus, particularly in the South China Sea, which has probably hurt ASEAN as a grouping in its ability to deal with China and push China to compromise a little bit over some of the big issues.
It was one of the interesting example you mentioned was when Laos hosted the regional summit. It was Laos chairmanship in 2016 when the arbitral tribunal ruling was announced, and Laos as a chair managed to put that in the joint statement. But it hosted the summit in a conference center that was built with the Chinese assistance. So that was quite an interesting point to point out. I might just focus a little bit more on Vietnam, because your book actually starts with Vietnam, starts with 1979 in the border war with China. And as you mentioned, this is one of the way that's really started your interest in the region. Vietnam, in many aspects, is an outlier in Southeast Asia at the moment, but it has gone through different phases. It is one that is willing to stand up to China, as we know from the historical experiences. But at the same time, the question is whether it will be, that's the only way to sustain pressure with China, is risking that potential confrontation. Are we really in the position is either really accept the Chinese aggressive position or standing up and possibly risking that confrontation? What is the best way you think Southeast Asia should respond to China's assertive role?
Well, the Vietnamese have they have their own history with China, right? It dates back thousands of years. For many countries, it's much more recent, their experience with China. China, I mean, I think Vietnam is somewhat between the two extremes of either letting China push them around or totally standing up to China. Obviously, Vietnam could go further with the United States, for example, but and the military cooperation, I can tell you the Pentagon would be very interested in that. But Vietnam only goes very cautiously. They always look over their shoulder. What's China going to say? And they, you know, and when China started putting a lot of pressure on the oil and gas exploration, when China put an oil rig off the coast of central Vietnam in 2014, Vietnam really didn't have big technology to stand up to them, but they sent hundreds of little boats up there to just like gnats going after a water buffalo or something. And you know, finally the Chinese decided to leave. They also, you know, but when China put a lot of pressure on for a Spanish oil company to pull out in 2018, Vietnam gave in quite easily, quite quickly. And it cost Vietnam a lot of money. It's estimated at least $500 million because they pushed out they asked the company Repsol to stop exploring for oil and gas, despite the fact that they had a longer term contract. But then with Vietnam, but then when China started pushing in 2019, last year, Vietnam had a partnership with Repsol, with Rosneft, which is a Russian company, and the Russian company was willing to stand up. So it worked to Vietnam's advantage to have a company that was quite tough. But Vietnam does not really stand up to China in a lot of areas. And although they do not take, they have a few projects that are called Belt and Road, but they actually aren't, because some of them began long before the Belt and Road and still aren't finished, like the Sky Train in Hanoi, which is really been a project just plagued with problems from way back, cost overruns, delays, parts falling off the railroad and hitting motorcycles down below, killing people. It's been a real mess of a project. And when the closest port for Kunming to the sea is Haiphong, and some people actually think Haiphong in northern Vietnam, and some historians have argued that maybe that was Haiphong that caused China to occupy Vietnam for those 1,000 years, because they wanted access to a port. But Vietnam said, okay, we'll give you access to the port, but if you need, then the Chinese said, okay, we'll build a road. And they said, you can build a road to our border, and we'll build a road from Haiphong to your border. They did not take Chinese money for that project. But it's interesting that, you know, so they have party-to-party ties. I got a fair amount of access to party officials to talk about this, and they said party ties are actually pretty tense. When the oil rig came in 2014, they couldn't get anybody from the senior levels of the party to answer their phone calls. And when they were getting ready for the last party Congress in 2016, Vietnam opened up for a lot of views expressed by former officials, academics, and China actually, I've heard this both from the Chinese and the Vietnamese. The Chinese complain because you're showing far too much democracy, and it's going to backfire on you, Vietnam. Or we're going to have people in China pushing for the same level of openness, where letting 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of viewpoints. And they say that the Vietnamese party people say that their dialogues with China and the party level are really quite strained. It's all pro forma. They have one side reads their statements, and the other side reads their statements, and they have coffee, and then one side reads their statements. They don't really talk. Which is understandable considering their proximity and the pressure that China puts on them. So it's a really complicated relationship. It's kind of interesting to watch, but a lot of what they do, others can't do, just because they don't have the proximity, the history, the party relationships.
Yes. Well, I could continue this topic forever, but I see a number of questions started to coming in, and obviously we can't talk about Southeast Asia too long before the US comes up in the picture as well, and the US-China competition in the region. So Richard Moore from Asia Society Australia asks, overall, in terms of relative US-China influence, is the trend favoring China? If so, will growing Chinese influence coexist with ongoing efforts by Southeast Asian states to protect their independence, or do you see a more fundamental tilt towards China's orbit? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing that the Southeast Asians are hell-bent on keeping is their independence, their sovereignty. Um, all of these countries, except Thailand, were colonies at the end of World War II, if I think so. And they only got their independence in the last 70 years. And so they're really not very interested in running off with a new big power. So a lot of countries are one of the things that I describe in considerable detail in most chapters is how countries try to balance off China and the US. Many ways they have increasingly moved toward China for economic support, and they often look to the US for security. That has become more complicated with the trade war. Um, it's complicated because China, the Southeast Asians, the major economies, uh, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Philippines, some extent, are all contributing to the supply chain that goes through China and producing the particularly IT kind of technology, smartphones and those kinds of things. Now, if the U.S. bans certain technology coming from China, it's going to really dent the production the places where the Southeast Asian manufacturing can sell their products. So that's a problem, and there's a real concern within Southeast Asia that the growing split between China and the US could cause a bifurcation of the global economy, or at least a bifurcation of technology. It's not, I think it is almost impossible for the US to separate totally from China. It's so integrated. But on technology, it might be possible. And that means that there'll be two kinds of internet, two kinds of technology that works in the IT space. That there's a lot of worry that countries are going to have to choose, that they can't keep walking the fine line between them. And it's hard to know what happens if the current president is not reelected on November 3rd. Obviously, his competitor, former Vice President Biden, is a person who's less strident. He uses less emotional language. He probably isn't quite as enthralled by tariffs, but it is. I think the United States is at a point of grave frustration with China, which has been growing in recent years, and it's likely that Biden will not be able to, maybe doesn't even want to walk everything back that has happened. So he might look for other ways to cooperate with China, which Southeast Asia really hopes. They do not want to have to choose, but we really don't know. He could cooperate in areas such as climate change, for example, or maybe Iran. Maybe Iran's too far gone. I don't know. But some of those, and certainly you could cooperate like they did after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 for global economic recovery. Right now, they are sort of going on parallel paths, not talking to each other about that situation. So it is a huge issue, and it's huge for Southeast Asians. They're very worried.
We'll get back to US in a second, but I just wanted to follow up on your points about the technology. China's grant plan also includes the so-called digital Silk Road and investment in the cyberspace and e-commerce, everything online, which the region is really, really dynamic. The Southeast Asian region is very dynamic and has a huge potential as well as need. So we've mentioned earlier that the regular Belt and Road Initiative has some pushback, but I wonder, how do you assess China's efforts in building digital Silk Road and in involvement in building up the online technology and innovation and digital economy. Because, for example, Indonesia alone is the biggest and fastest growing in e-commerce and online purchases, has very young and very capable, digitally capable population that is in its infiltration of mobile network, and it's the Alibabas, the Huawei's, the ZTEs, and Tencents have huge presence there, and they also invest in innovation hubs. So that's just Indonesia alone, where you have across the region a huge need for that. And so far, only when it comes to 5G, only Vietnam and I think Singapore right now are opting for other suppliers than Huawei. But no one has officially said no to Huawei, right? So how do you assess China's digital Silk Road efforts in Southeast Asia?
I think it's for China, it's going quite well. So China is a huge investor in a lot of the e-commerce, the e-tourism, although that might fizzle out, and a lot of the innovation, a lot of the new startups. China plays a big role, and like you said, they have set up innovation hubs in Indonesia and Singapore. Yeah, so Huawei, ZTE are big players in all the countries except the two you mentioned, and they're playing a role in getting the 5G up and running in Thailand and Indonesia, Philippines, etc. An investment in startups and in the digital space, the U.S. is really very far behind what China's doing, it's the U.S. is really far behind in the e-payment system. But Alibaba, WePay, they're all accepted in most of these countries. You go get in a taxi in Singapore and you hand a US-based credit card to the driver, he throws a fit. He says, "Don't you have Alipay?" Because the money goes straight into my account. So it's even in places like Singapore that are very, very cautious about China, and Philippines, the Chinese, their digital capabilities are really well appreciated and very widely used. And then in places they're also involved, even in Singapore airport. I think it's Huawei that has artificial intelligence monitoring, and it's either the Terminal 3 or 4 in Singapore. Yeah.
I'm sure there's also concerns about China exporting the surveillance capabilities and encouraging authoritarian tendencies and control over citizens in the Southeast Asian region. So that's a lot of concerns there. But going back to the US, there was a question: what do Southeast Asians want from the US, especially those who have active claims in the South China Sea? What is that the Southeast Asian claimant want from US?
Well, it's hard to summarize that because they're all so different. I think Vietnam appreciates the stepped up condemnation of China's aggressiveness in the South China Sea, and the move last week to sanction 24 companies that were involved, for example, in grinding up coral and sand, pulling it up and turning it into islands, which is obviously very destructive for the fish. Malaysia is much, and Vietnam also likes the freedom of navigation exercises, which send a signal to China. The US doesn't recognize some of its moves. Malaysia really is a bit, like to just fly under the radar, and they really almost got away with it until last year when China started putting a lot of pressure on Shell, which is very active off the coast of Sabah and Sarawak. doing a lot of exploration and joint development with Petronas, the oil company. Philippines is a little bit schizophrenic because of Duterte there. He is trying to find ways to cooperate with China. Not that it's gotten him anything, because China has, one of the things that did surprise me also doing my research is how little, despite the fact that Duterte has put the arbitral tribunal ruling in his pocket and said he is willing, he wants to work with China and find ways to cooperate. China hasn't really given him very much. They haven't given him access to Scarborough Shoal, which they took from Philippines in 2012 for their fishermen. They haven't done, of the 24 billion that Duterte signed in aid projects in October 2016, none of them have been implemented. China just built a couple of small bridges, a couple of small irrigation canals. And then Brunei is really also totally trying to fly under the radar and not speak out too much. And China sort of is leaving Brunei alone. They have far smaller areas of overlapping claims. Yeah, I think that basically Southeast Asia would like the US, and maybe joined from time to time by Japan and Australia, to stand up to China and warn them not to go too far, but they don't want to put their own how should I say it, put too much on the line themselves, lest China react strongly and punish them for it.
Yes, speaking of Australia, I have to ask the question, how do you see Australia traveling in Southeast Asia? Because obviously Australia also recognized Southeast Asia as its primary interest area. It has featured in a number of documents, including the Foreign Policy White Paper, but also in a recent strategic update. And Australia's also a posture is relatively quite active in recent years and recent months. How do you read Australia's engagement in the region, and what else it can strengthen, what else it is that Australia can do?
Well, Australia can lead countries like the US, and maybe also cooperate with Japan to do some things, like in the Mekong. Along the Mekong, Australia has been very active in dealing with crime, transnational crime, with drugs, with trafficking and wildlife trafficking in people. And the US has recently joined Australia in that project. I think, you almost have to talk about the other countries like Australia and Japan, the EU, Korea, India, almost in a group. Because Southeast Asia does look to them to be a balance in the middle of the tensions between China and Australia, and want these countries to be as active as possible. I think, some people were disappointed when Australia started a number of years ago to cut back on some of its foreign aid, but Australia is a well-respected middle power that they would like to see be more active and serve as a kind of hedge against China.
And Australia has been very active in the regional diplomacy platforms, and it was one of the first, if not really first, the dialogue partner with ASEAN. And there is a question about ASEAN as an institution. So how do you think ASEAN respond to the Beijing, and does it generally help? Does it have a helpful role in the region, or it is really being divided and conquered at the moment, and really the ASEAN consensus is being exploited in this great power competition, and by China in particular?
Well, most big powers, including both China and the US, they sort of deal with one country, deal with countries individually, which does probably help with some of the divisions. I think ASEAN could play a more important role if they would agree. And they now have the consensus arrangement so that if one country decides they don't want to support a certain position, then ASEAN can't move forward. And it was interesting that in I think June, when Vietnam is this year the chair of ASEAN, when they hosted a meeting, virtual meeting, to discuss the issues they wanted to raise with other countries, with other powers. Vietnam pushed for raising the challenges in the Mekong River. And the challenges being that, as I mentioned earlier, that China's dams are holding back a lot of water, a lot of silt, and that's meaning that there's been drought. We're heading into drought now for the second year in a row in Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, along which 60 million people live and make their living off the Mekong and its products. Once there's a blockage in water, and that also affects the movement of fish for spawning. And so, as you maybe know, the Mekong, the Tonle Sap in Cambodia is a big freshwater lake in Cambodia that changes the river that leads to the Mekong from the Tonle Sap changes direction, and it flows one way during rainy season, the other way during the dry season, and that is a really big regulator that helps fish reproduce. And that the Mekong, the Tonle Sap is barely expanding last year and this year. And it's also in the Mekong Delta. In Vietnam, there's less silt, less water, so there's encroachment from the salt water in the South China Sea. So that Vietnam was trying to raise that issue to start raising with China, but there was blockage from other countries. So I guess, and the other thing I felt that is if ASEAN would cooperate a little bit more, the thing that struck me as bizarre is that that China offered Laos and Thailand a cheaper interest rate for the railroad than they offered Malaysia. Malaysia, just merely because their prime minister was doing other things besides developing the economy, is ultimately padding his own personal wealth, but he didn't seem to raise these issues. If ASEAN would compare notes on what China is up to, they could easily negotiate far more equal kind of deals on infrastructure, for example, on interest rates, on how many Chinese workers you have to have, how much technology you have to buy from China, that kind of thing. And China does not like to be, totally in the minority and shamed a lot. And so if ASEAN would find ways to agree, or could make decisions with ASEAN 10-1, so if one country doesn't agree, they could maybe have a position that could represent ASEAN, but without everybody agreeing, they could probably have a lot more influence and push back on China with more heft than they can at the moment.
Yes, and speaking of Mekong, Japan is really another power that really is active in Mekong and truly involved and committed throughout the years. Otherwise, unlike South China Sea, Mekong countries would be left alone to China's devices almost. But there's a question about the recent departure of Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Japan has traveled very well in Southeast Asia, and all the polls, hands down, it always is the most well-regarded of all major powers, and a lot of Southeast Asia look up to Japan. So the question to you by Nguyen is, how do Southeast Asians see the change in Japan, and is the region increasingly looking to Tokyo to overweight against Beijing, but also can we expect similar approach under the new leadership, do you think?
Wow, that's a early question. Abe is still on the throne. The body isn't cold yet. Yeah, but they will in the coming weeks select a new leader. But it sort of, I think, depends on which one they select. I think there is considerable consensus in the LDP, the ruling party, that Southeast Asia is an important place where Japan can play an important role. But we're going to have to see, because the leaders over the last decade or so have been so very different in how their outlooks on foreign policy and engagement with the region, that I think it's really too early to speculate very much. But I know that Southeast Asians would hope that Japan will be active enough to continue hedging, helping them hedge a little bit at least against China.
So we're talking about other external powers, but there is also a factor of China sometimes maybe overplaying or over-calculating its own influence. And Malcolm Cook asked whether you see an anti-Chinese nationalism in Southeast Asian countries growing, and how would that itself limit Beijing's influence in the region?
Wow, that's a good question too. It is very obvious that that the elites have a lot of questions about China and its role and what it's trying to get them to do. I don't think there will be ultimate uprising, because they know they can be crushed pretty easily. But I think you could see Southeast Asia pushing back on big projects, on China getting too involved in domestic politics, on pushing. I think Southeast Asia could have a huge role in pushing China to be more transparent on how much water it's taking out of the Mekong. Two dams alone, according to the Eye on the World that released satellite photos maybe 2 or 3 months ago. I can't think of an Australian example, but those 2 dams hold as much water as the Chesapeake Bay, the bay that's the huge bay that's about 40, 50, 60 kilometers outside of Washington. So I think they could convince China that if China wants to be a regional player, it's going to have to be play a little bit more nice with the neighbors who are being devastated by China holding back all this water, so that it can keep producing electricity all year round. But you know, I think young people in all the countries that I visited to do research on this book, I found young people being quite critical of China. They aren't very enthralled with its soft power, except those that want a scholarship or those that want to learn Mandarin so they can get a job with a Chinese company. But I think overall, young people are much more enthralled, for example, with Korean culture, South Korean culture, and their K-pop and their some women with their cosmetics, although I don't know if we still want their whitening cosmetics after what's happening in parts of the world right now on race issues. But I think Southeast Asia has more agency than they recognize, and I think if they spoke with one voice to China and the United States, they probably could often have a lot more influence than they think. But they all are cultivating their own interests because they think they can play they can play China off and get advantages that the neighbor won't get.
Very well said. Unfortunately, that's all time we've got. Apologies for those who got sent in question. I didn't get to it, but we don't want to talk about the all content of the book, because we want you to read the really excellent book. The book you can purchase on Amazon. There was a question where you can buy it. You can purchase on Amazon or on the Rowman and Littlefield publisher website as well. And I highly recommend, because there is a wealth of that in-depth knowledge and information that everybody needs to know about this very important region and where the strategic interests of China and US, and as we mentioned as well, Japan, Australia, and many others meet. So I'd like to thank Murray. Thank you very much to joining us and having one of the very first virtual lounges. And it's very late for you, so thank you for staying up, and thank you for the audience to joining us today. I will have keep an eye on the new events at ASPI, but thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you sometime soon, maybe in person, hopefully.
Thanks, Huong, and thanks everybody. It was a pleasure speaking with you.